okay, Mr. President. I said, remember?
Oh, yeah.
I said, well, I did a photo shoot in Vermont. I had two pictures. One was the side of the treaty with barbershop. And very serious. And then this one. Everybody said, I didn't have a sense of humor.
I just want to quickly confirm, after the motion to discharge, assuming
Anyway,
that it is successful, the nomination goes on the calendar,
Yes.
so there's no reporting.
No.
Good,
Just goes on the call.
good.
You're on.
I just want to,
You're on. President,
Democratic leader.
are we in quorum?
We are,
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
without objection.
Now, Madam President, yesterday the Senate completed an extremely productive day by confirming three members of President Biden's cabinet. Today, we're going to keep up the pace by moving the ball forward on two more of the president's nominees. First, the Senate will begin the process of bringing Xavier Becerra's nomination to serve as HHS Secretary to the floor. This is a critical position as we continue to battle the virus, and I'm perplexed that none of my Republican colleagues would vote for him. He's a capable man. He's worked hard to make sure that people get health care. And some have said, well, he's not a doctor. Neither was the previous Trump nominee for HHS, who happened to be a pharmaceutical company executive. What would Americans prefer? Second, the Senate will move forward with another very historic nominee that makes us so proud, Rep. Deb Haaland of New Mexico, to serve as the next Secretary of the Interior. She'll be confirmed on Monday. Rep. Haaland was elected to the Congress in 2018. She was the first Native American woman, along with Representative Sharice Davis from Kansas, to ever serve in the People's House. If confirmed, Rep. Haaland would not only become the first Native American to lead the Department of Interior, she would be the first Native American to serve in any cabinet position in American history. We've had a vice president with Native American roots, but never a cabinet official. Given the long and troubled relationship between the federal government and tribal nations, the ascension of Rep. Haaland to the top of the Interior Department is a profoundly important moment for America as we advance on the long road, still not fully traveled at all, of equality or towards equality. For too long, tribal nations have been denied a seat at the table where decisions that were made that impacted their lives and their land. Not only will Secretary Haaland ensure that they get a seat, she will bring her own lived experiences to the table alongside them. Under President Trump, the Department of Interior became one of the most scandal-riddled agencies in the history of the federal government. It gave oil and mining companies carte blanche to drill in wildlife reserves, rolled back environmental protections, and greatly undermined trust in the federal government and tribal lands. Rep. Haaland will move the department in a dramatically different direction. One of her most important responsibilities will be to restore and uphold the federal government's obligation to sovereign tribal nations. I cannot think of a better candidate to take on this job than Rep. Haaland, and I greatly look forward to confirming her. It will be historic. Now, in general, Madam President, the Senate is making great progress in installing President Biden's highly qualified nominees. So far, we've already confirmed 16 cabinet-level appointments. We're set to increase that number to 18 after Secretaries Haaland and Becerra are approved. Every single one of the president's nominees has been confirmed with a bipartisan vote here on the Senate floor. President Biden deserves to have his team in place, and the Senate is moving quickly to get the job done. Now, on the American Rescue Plan, which finally cleared the hurdle in Congress yesterday by passing the House. The plan is now only a signature away, a presidential signature from becoming law. Soon, very soon, the most sweeping recovery effort in recent history will get underway. Direct checks will be delivered to American families from coast to coast, roughly 85% of all households. The American people can expect those $1,400 checks for each person in the family to be delivered by the end of March. And we're making amazingly good progress on vaccines. Vaccines will be available far more quickly to far more people. Just this morning, the Biden administration announced an expansion of the vaccine program. And I was able to announce that more than 100 community health centers in my home state of New York will be eligible to get their own dedicated supply of vaccines. There is a brand new vaccine supercharge for New York and for some of the rest of the nation as well. The crux, more vaccines and more sites to administer them Over 100 sites will be set up across New York State and administer a massive influx of new shot supplies. There is light at the end of this COVID tunnel, which has always been centered on access to a free vaccine for all New Yorkers. More access and more shots means a quicker recovery, and that's what we want. And that is becoming available for my home state of New York and for the entire nation. The CHC sites, community health center sites, will be federally funded, organized by the Department of Health and Human Services, a huge expansion. We have all heard stories, numerous stories, of people having to travel too far to get the vaccine, hampering our ability to recover and return to normal. With this announcement of more vaccines and more New York sites to administer them, New Yorkers have something to celebrate. And I thank the President for working with us to make this effort real and to bring it to every state in the nation. Now, other things are happening too. Our schools will receive critical assistance to update their infrastructure, to hire more teachers and tutors, and prepare to reopen as fast and as safe as possible. There's going to be money for broadband. There's going to be dollars for rural hospitals. There's going to be dollars to help our tribal nations, all who are suffering. The new Restaurants Act, so important to so many of our states, is becoming law. More money for Save Our Stages to help our arts institutions is coming. And perhaps the thing that we are most proud of, although there are so many in this bill, helping people with their pensions, making sure those who are laid off still get health care by funding COBRA fully. So many good things for average working families. But maybe the most important of all, who knows? There's so many good things in this bill, but maybe it's the child tax credit, which will cut childhood poverty in half. When a child is born into poverty, no fault of his or her own, they don't get adequate nutrition. They don't get adequate health care. They don't get adequate housing. They don't get adequate education. And then when they go into young adulthood, they have nowhere to go. And then they get blamed for their plight. The better, smarter, more effective thing to do is help them get out of poverty early so they can lead good, productive lives as citizens and as taxpayers. We're doing that for the first time here, and I hope it's something that we can continue. Simply put, the American Rescue Plan is one of the most significant pieces of legislation to pass the Congress in recent history. Yesterday, I started describing in more detail some of the lesser-known aspects of the plan. Everyone knows the vaccines are coming. The $1,400 checks are coming. The money for schools is coming. And now people know of the child tax credit. But there are lots of other things in this bill. Today, I want to continue by talking about another unheralded provision, assistance to Native communities, a topic very much on theme today, given the nomination of Secretary Haaland. One of the most tragic features of the COVID-19 pandemic is how destructive it has been for America's tribal nations. Native Americans have faced the highest risk of infections, hospitalizations, and deaths due to COVID-19, bar none, the highest. Early in the crisis, the Navajo Nation, to take one example, saw more cases per capita than any other state in the country. Decades of an unraveling social safety net, declining economic opportunity, an overburdened health system, and the failure of the federal government to honor its trust obligations to American tribes left Native communities unequipped to handle the crisis. But in the American Rescue Plan, Democrats will deliver the single largest investment in Native programs in our nation's history. We are very proud of that. It is historic. The single largest investment in Native communities in our nation's history. More than $31.2 billion in direct funding will go to the tribes and communities to defeat this pandemic and rebuild their communities. $20 billion directly to tribal governments so they can stabilize essential services, $6 billion to the Indian Health Service, not just for vaccines and testing and tracing, but to improve and restore these rural, long-neglected hospitals. $100 million more for Native education. $10 million will go to just make sure communities can access clean water. Listen to the items I just mentioned: clean water, keeping hospitals running, connecting kids to broadband. These are absolute necessities. And the American Rescue Plan is going to dedicate resources to all of them for Indian country. I want to thank a whole bunch of my colleagues. So many contributed. But the chair of the Indian Affairs Committee, Senator Schatz, Senators Tester and Cantwell and Smith and Kelly and Benray, Lujan, Heinrich, very, very important. Heinrich particularly pushed for broadband. So it's a team effort, and I'm proud of my colleagues. The American Rescue Plan takes us a giant step closer to fulfilling our trust responsibilities to all Native Americans, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians. This is just one example, an important one, how the Rescue Plan will dramatically improve the lives of millions of people in this great country of ours. I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President,
Republican leader,
I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
without objection.
Madam President, a year ago, coronavirus cases were beginning to climb on U.S. soil. Shutdown measures were starting to take effect. Americans have endured one of the strangest and most painful years in living memory. Nearly 2 million Americans have been hospitalized with serious cases of the virus. More than 500,000 have lost their lives. Millions of students and workers have had their lives completely thrown off course. But these dark times have also spotlighted some of the best of America. Heroism, selflessness, ingenuity. Last March, the night we passed the CARES Act without a single dissenting vote, I said we'd see a new generation of American heroes, and so we have. Doctors and nurses and first responders have worked tirelessly to help their fellow Americans. Essential workers kept manning their posts and prevented economic collapse. Neighbors looked out for neighbors, and small businesses shifted gears almost overnight. Children and parents have fought to adapt to extraordinary disruptions. And incredible heroes and lab coats in America and worldwide worked at light speed to decode this new enemy and create life-saving vaccines in record time. Today, together, we're standing on the cusp of a new springtime for our country, not like anything we've experienced in our lifetimes. More than 95 million vaccine doses have reached American arms, another 2 million every single day. COVID-related deaths have plummeted, now less than half of their high, particularly for the elderly and the vulnerable. Science reaffirms kids can be safely in the classroom right now. States are starting to lift blanket restrictions, freeing citizens and small businesses to follow smart precautions themselves. And for weeks, every indicator has suggested our economy is poised to come roaring back with more job openings for Americans who need work. None of these trends began on January 20th. President Biden and his Democratic government inherited a tide that had already begun to turn toward decisive victory. In 2020, Congress passed 5 historic bipartisan bills to save our health system, protect our economic foundations, and fund Operation Warp Speed to find vaccines. Senate Republicans led the bipartisan CARES Act that got our country through the last year. The American people already built a parade that's been marching toward victory. Democrats just want to sprint in front of the parade and claim credit. So when 10 Republican senators went to the White House to suggest working together, a Democrat said no. Both the Democratic leader and the White House chief of staff now indicate they think President Obama's problem was that he was too bipartisan. This time, as one journalist put it, the situation was, quote, Democrats to GOP, take it or leave it, end quote. The it that we're talking about here was a bill that only spent about 1% on vaccines and about 9% on the entire health fight. The rest of the tab went to things like this: a $350 billion bailout for state and local budgets unrelated to pandemic needs, with strings attached to stop states from cutting taxes on their own citizens down the road. Take the money, you don't get to cut taxes. Massive federal school funding spread over several years without requiring quick reopening. Sweeping new government benefit, no work requirements whatsoever. A time warp to the bad times before bipartisan welfare reform, which Democrats all say they want to make permanent. An agricultural assistance conditioned not on specific financial need, but solely on the demographics of the farmer, which some liberal activists are celebrating as reparations. Only about 20% of the spending went to $1,400 direct checks to try to and keep all of the unrelated socialism out of the spotlight. This wasn't a bill to finish off the pandemic. It was a multi-trillion-dollar Trojan horse full of bad, old liberal ideas. President Biden's own staff keep calling this legislation, quote, the most progressive bill in American history. Hardly the common sense bipartisanship the president promised. So pause today at 1 year mark to remember and to mourn. But we also look with great optimism to the future. 2021 is to be a historic comeback year, not because of the far-left legislation that was passed after the tide had already turned, but because of the resilience of the American people. Now, Mr. President, on a completely different matter, at noon today, the Senate will vote on whether to pluck the Becerra nomination out of committee after it failed to garner enough support to advance. Every one of President Biden's nominations the Senate has considered so far has received bipartisan support for confirmation. There's a reason Mr. Becerra could not get one single Republican vote to move out of committee. It's because he's such a thoroughly partisan actor with so little subject matter expertise and such a demonstrated history of hostility toward basic values like the freedom of science, of conscience, the freedom of conscience. There's nothing about Mr. Becerra's record in Congress or in California to suggest he's the best possible person to run the Department of Health and Human Services in the middle of a once-in-a-generation viral pandemic. Not even close. This is too important a job at too important a time for this administration to put raw partisanship ahead of qualifications. So I would strongly urge all senators to vote against rescuing this nomination from committee. Let's give the president the opportunity to make a better selection. Now, Mr. President, on one final matter, as I've mentioned, it's customary for some top Senate staff positions to see new faces when party control changes hands. Today, it's my honor to pay tribute to Mary Sue Jones, a huge asset to this institution, who's become an institution herself. Tomorrow, Mary will finish her second separate run as Assistant Secretary of the Senate and conclude a Senate career that has spanned more than a quarter of a century. I first met Mary Jones in the mid-1990s when we brought her on board to help manage my office. Neither I nor Mary's colleagues back then could have predicted that nearly 30 years later, she'd depart as one of the most senior officers in the entire place. But the truth is, if you had told us, nobody would have been even a little surprised either. I've entrusted Mary with a lot of different responsibilities over the years. She served as our office manager just a few years out of college. She came with me to the Rules Committee, first as Deputy Staff Director and then the top job. Senator Frist had the good judgment to ask her to be Assistant Secretary in the early 2000s. Then she returned to Rules and resumed serving as our side staff director under Senators Bob Bennett, Lamar Alexander, and then Pat Roberts. And finally, she generously brought all of this expertise and institutional knowledge back to the Assistant Secretary role 6 years ago. In her first job in my office, Mary organized one team of people and our infrastructure. In her current job, she's overseen 26 departments and scores of Senate staff, pushing resources and guidance down and pushing information up. In between, at Rules, she tackled things like helping run presidential inaugurations. Through it all, I cannot name one time when Mary Jones did not deliver. She is consistent, competent, and completely reliable. No wonder her name has become a kind of catchphrase around the Senate when anyone's trying to track down some key piece of wisdom or is puzzling over how to get something done. Well, let's ask Mary Jones. Have you checked with Mary Jones? I think Mary knows all about that. Everyone from junior staff to senior senators, Republicans and Democrats have been able to count on Mary for expertise and execution. On a million different subjects, she knows the answer to the question you're going to ask before you even finish asking it. A rock-solid administrator, a consummate professional, she is just that good. So I'm sorry to see Mary depart the Senate, but she's given generously to this place. She certainly earned the opportunity to apply her many talents to some new challenges and perhaps knock a few miles off of her famously epic commute while she's at it. The whole Senate thanks Mary for her excellent service. We wish her, her husband, and their kids a little bit in the exciting chapters ahead.
This is closed. On the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the motion to discharge the nomination of Xavier Becerra from the Committee on Finance. Senator from Oregon.
President.
Will the Senator suspend?
Yes.
Proceed.
Mr. President, the Senate is debating the nomination to discharge from the Finance Committee the nomination of California Attorney General Xavier Becerra to head the Department of Health and Human Services. As chairman of the Finance Committee, I'm going to begin with a simple message. Holding up the nomination of Attorney General Becerra has been blocking urgent antivirus work that needs to get done now. So it is time for the Senate to act quickly without politics getting in the way to confirm this nominee. I also believe, Mr. President, moving quickly on this nomination will help to achieve something I heard a lot of senators talk about over the last few days. A few days ago, I spent almost 24 hours here at this desk while the Senate was debating a number of different issues. Over the course of that debate, and in the weeks before it, many senators talked about how important it was to get past some of the long-standing disagreements and find unity. I will say to my colleagues, there could not be a more unifying prospect for America, ending this public health nightmare as quickly as possible, preventing as many COVID-19 deaths as possible, and helping the American people get back to the activities that they enjoy, that they consider part of their normal daily routine. Having a confirmed secretary leading the Department of Health and Human Services is a linchpin for accomplishing that task. The department is right at the effort, at the forefront, to end this contagion. It's leading the distribution of vaccines. It's working to get PPE in hands of nurses and doctors who still desperately need more of it. It's getting new resources to rural hospitals to keep them afloat and to keep their doors open to patients who literally have nowhere else to go during this crisis. Health and Human Services is right in the center of the government-wide COVID response. They coordinate work at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, with the Centers for Disease Control, with the National Institutes of Health, with the National Guard, with all 50 states, with the District of Columbia, with private healthcare systems and doctors across the country, and more individuals and organizations that are just too numerous to name. Now, that's what the job is all about and why it's so critical right now. And I want to turn to some of what I've heard discussed with respect to Attorney General Becerra. I've heard some say that, well, he doesn't have the right leadership experience. That's a comment being made about the head of America's second largest Department of Justice. This nominee is in charge of $1 billion budget. This nominee is in charge of more than 4,000 employees. The top law enforcement official in what would be the 5th largest economy in the world. This is work of somebody who really knows how to run a mammoth agency. Then there's suggestions about his healthcare background. This is one that, to me, is just bizarre given his track record. He spent years and years on the House Ways and Means Committee, which is one of the key committees in the country with respect to jurisdiction over healthcare policy. He wrote and debated major pieces of healthcare legislation, including playing an important role in the development of the Affordable Care Act. As California's Attorney General, he defended the Affordable Care Act in court. When the pandemic hit, he stepped up and fought to protect the health and well-being of millions of Californians, particularly nurses and doctors and other workers who found themselves in harm's way. Now, when you're in the Senate, you understand that members of the opposing party are going to have disagreements on policy issues. That goes with the turf. Women's health care was obviously one of those issues that came up during the nomination hearing. I will tell you that Attorney General Becerra's response is what we ought to expect of responsible public officials and of nominees. He made it clear to members of the Finance Committee. He said again and again and again that he will follow the law. He will be accessible to all senators. He's going to work to find common ground on key healthcare issues. And I can tell you, having specialized in healthcare since my days with the Oregon Gray Panthers, that is heavy lifting. And by the way, I think it's pretty refreshing after 4 years of just blather about repeal and replace and empty rhetoric and promises on pharmaceutical price gouging and partisan policies that favored insurance companies over the typical American consumer. In my view, Attorney General Becerra proved in his nomination hearing that he knows healthcare policy inside and out, and that he is ready to lead the Department of Health and Human Services. And I don't think anybody ought to be particularly surprised, because he has got a decades-long track record of healthcare leadership and policy experience that's going to help him succeed in the job. We all understand that the country's healthcare system is still under extraordinary pressure and strain. On Saturday, the Senate passed one of the largest public health packages in our country's history, designed to crush this pandemic. So we're starting to see some light. We're starting to see the end of the tunnel. And the Biden administration is doing everything it can to acquire more vaccines, to get more shots into arms. I think we all understand it's not a task completed yet. I'll just close by way of saying that when our country faces a healthcare crisis, it needs a Secretary of Health and Human Services confirmed and on the job as soon as possible. It doesn't need more political games and delay that only sets back our effort to end the pandemic. So we'll be voting, I believe, in less than an hour, Mr. President, and I just want to say that I hope colleagues will support this nominations discharged from the Finance Committee. I have known the Attorney General for a number of years. As I say, this is the area that I have specialized over the years. And I know that senators have differences of opinion with respect to health care. But differences of opinion shouldn't stand in the way of a qualified public official who's managed thousands of people, even in his current job. For example, from having the opportunity to do what has to be done for this country, and that is to get a confirmed nominee for a critical position so that he can attack those challenges that are in front of us right now and help patients and speed up the effort to end the pandemic. Mr. President, I yield the floor. The absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Well, let me just say, this is just what America needs. 80% of Americans will get a check for $1,400. You're a family of four, you get $5,600. That is help that people need. So many people can't feed their kids or might kicked out of their homes. And even those who are not that way, more costs for transportation, or if you have a kid in college or schooling. So the $1,400 matters. Help is on the way.
For Defense Secretary, for Attorney General, for Director of National Intelligence, for Agriculture Secretary, and others. His candidates were not the ones that I would have picked if I were president, but I believe it's important for our country that our president have a team in place. And as long as the president's nominees aren't raising serious concerns, I think a president of either party is entitled to have the people he or she chooses serving in his or her administration. But by the same token, if a president's nominee does raise serious concerns, I think we have a responsibility as senators to oppose him or her. Today, Mr. President, I rise to oppose the president's nominee to head the Department of Health and Human Services. A number of President Biden's nominees have been qualified, mainstream candidates. Xavier Becerra is not a mainstream candidate. He's an extremist who has used the offices he has held to advance an aggressively pro-abortion agenda and to target religious liberty and freedom of conscience. Mr. Becerra does not represent the views of a majority of Americans. He represents the views of the radical pro-abortion wing of the Democrat Party. Mr. President, the Planned Parenthood wing of the Democrat Party would like Americans to believe that unrestricted abortion on demand up to the moment of birth is a no-brainer, an unqualified good. But the truth is, despite decades of trying to convince Americans of this, Americans simply don't agree. Just 29% of Americans believe that abortion should be legal in all circumstances. The vast majority of Americans believe that abortion should either be illegal or that there should be at least some restrictions. Undoubtedly, because on some level, every American is aware that when we talk about abortion, we're talking about killing a human being. Mr. Becerra, on the other hand, does not seem to support any restrictions on abortion. If he does, I would sure like to hear about them. As a congressman, he earned perfect ratings from Planned Parenthood and NARAL. He assembled an overwhelmingly pro-abortion voting record, even opposing a ban on partial birth abortion, a procedure so heinous and repulsive it is difficult to even describe. As California Attorney General, he aggressively crusaded in favor of abortion. He's known for defending California's law forcing crisis pregnancy centers to advertise abortion, a case he lost at the Supreme Court on First Amendment grounds. But his activities were hardly limited to California abortion law. This was not a case of an attorney general simply defending the laws of his own state. No. As California Attorney General, Mr. Becerra repeatedly inserted himself into abortion debates in other states. He joined other attorneys general to file amicus briefs challenging abortion laws in Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, and other states, and he frequently led these efforts himself, a fact he proudly highlighted in press releases. Mr. President, Mr. Becerra's extremist views on abortion would be enough of a red flag. But to that, we have to add Mr. Becerra's record on religious liberty and freedom of conscience, most famously his efforts to force religious people, including nuns, to offer health insurance benefits that violate their religious beliefs. Now, at his Finance Committee hearing, Mr. Becerra tried to downplay his actions in this case. I never sued an order of nuns, he claimed. I've sued the federal government. Well, that's an answer only a lawyer could love, Mr. President. Yes, he didn't sue nuns. He sued the federal government to force nuns and other religious people to offer health insurance benefits that violate their consciences. That was the aim of his lawsuit, Mr. President, to force nuns and other religious Americans to act contrary to their consciences. And when an order of nuns, the Little Sisters of the Poor, joined the case in an effort to ensure their right to live according to their faith was protected, Mr. Becerra apparently had no hesitation in continuing his suit. Mr. President, Mr. Becerra's extremist views on abortion and his record on religious liberty would be troubling in any nominee. But they would matter a lot less if we were talking about a nominee for example, say, Secretary of Transportation. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about putting Mr. Becerra in charge of a cabinet. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about putting Mr. Becerra in charge of a cabinet department entrusted with interpreting and applying laws protecting religious freedom and freedom of conscience. And nothing I've seen suggests to me that Mr. Becerra can be relied on to provide robust protection for these cherished rights. In fact, I am profoundly concerned that Mr. Becerra would use his office to limit Americans' religious freedom. Under Mr. Becerra's HHS, are nuns going to be forced to offer health insurance benefits that violate their religious faith? Will healthcare professionals be protected from having to perform procedures like abortions that violate their consciences? Given Mr. Becerra's record, I'm concerned about the answers to these questions. In fact, Mr. President, there's reason to be concerned that a prime reason for nominating Mr. Becerra was his radical abortion advocacy and his attacks on religious liberty. It's difficult to find another reason for nominating Mr. Becerra during a global health emergency. Mr. Becerra is not a doctor. He's not worked in the healthcare field. He's not a virologist or a vaccine expert. He does not have a background in public health. It's not unreasonable to conclude that his appeal to the abortion left, one of the most powerful interest groups in the Democrat Party, was a prime reason for his nomination. NARAL, Planned Parenthood, certainly give credence to that idea with their enthusiastic statements in support of Mr. Becerra, which highlighted his aggressive abortion advocacy. I also have to say that it's pretty interesting to nominate someone to head HHS who in his last job proudly sued HHS repeatedly. Mr. President, I know that President Biden is a man of faith, but he is doing a great disservice to people of faith and to the First Amendment with this nomination. He's also doing a disservice to the American people by nominating a candidate whose views on abortion are so radical and so out of step with the views of most Americans. Mr. President, days ago, 3 of my Democrat colleagues broke ranks with their party to stand up for the many, many Americans who don't want their tax dollars going to pay for abortions. I urge them and all of my colleagues to join me in opposing the nomination of Xavier Becerra. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, we've got an issue in this country related to the pandemic, but more specifically related to children not going back to school. And Mr. President, one thing that is of incredible concern is it appears that the Biden administration, which campaigned saying that they were going to follow science, alleging that the previous administration was not, seems not to be following science, but to prejudice their recommendations to fit a political agenda. With that, Mr. President, let me develop my case. The harms of prolonged closure to school children are remarkable. They are well known. It's been up to a year since the schools have been closed, and in Mr. President's home state of California, there are some school systems which are still not reopened. Now think about this. A place where children go, not just to learn, but to have social workers make sure they aren't being abused at home, a dietary staff to make sure they have adequate nutrition, but also to learn, have been closed for a year. Now we can say, wait a second, don't worry about that, because the children have been given remote learning. There is ample data, Mr. President, which shows that particularly the children from lower income families are not logging on even when they are given a broadband computer, or given an internet-equipped computer to take home, or given Wi-Fi access to use at home. We can imagine it. Mom has to work. There's no one to supervise the child, so the 7-year-old is home by herself while mom is working. We can also imagine that a family does not have a culture of being online. We can imagine a big family of 7 or 8 kids where things just kind of get lost in the shuffle and there's not enough room for someone to be by themselves. Whatever, it is established that there are kids being left behind by not being in the classroom, and those kids disproportionately are poor. And that's why the Biden administration's pledge to follow science resonated, and that's why early indications that they are not is not just disappointing, it is a betrayal. And not a betrayal of a campaign pledge, a betrayal of those children who are at home. Now, by the way, data shows that children can safely go back to school. There was a CDC study from January of 2021 finding little evidence of virus spread in a school setting when the recommended precautions were taken. Which kind of calls, and by the way, there was a recent study by the following doctors, Henderson, Gandhi, Hoeg, and Johnson from universities such as the University of Chicago, UC Davis, and UC San Francisco, showing how safe it is to go to school, not get infected, and social distancing as minimal as 3 feet distant one from the other. Okay, just 3 feet distant. Now that is important, Mr. President, because if you say you can't bring kids back to school because you don't have enough classroom space for smaller classes, it's one thing if you say there must be 6 feet between each child, and another if there only needs to be 3 feet. So these doctors from these prestigious universities found you only needed 3 feet. That begs the question of why did the Centers for Disease Control in their February 26th document say that 6 feet were needed? Now you may say 6 feet, 3 feet, why does it make a difference? Because schools aren't reopening and their excuse is they need 6 feet between students. They are finding a reason to keep kids at home not learning on a spurious reason. The doctors who wrote this paper just put an editorial in USA Today. And a nice quote here, I say nice, it kind of summarizes, it's disappointing that they have to say this, is that they open up with the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, which is the quote from the Franklin Roosevelt, but go on to say, to speak of the lost wages for families and the poverty and eviction that this is resulting in, but that the research says there are greater risks to life expectancies with schools closed versus schools open. But they then ask that we overcome fear by following the science. And the science says we can safely reopen our schools now, full-time, non-hybrid, and keep them open. Unfortunately, that is not what the Centers for Disease Control is saying. Now, by the way, there's a clear agenda here. Part of the agenda is that teachers' unions in certain communities have not wanted to reopen. They're more concerned about the union than they are about the children. And so whether it is the Democratic mayor of Chicago trying to force the teachers' union into Chicago to reopen, whether it is Los Angeles or San Diego, which have still not reopened, with teachers' unions objecting to reopening there, not based upon science, not based upon risk to the teachers or the children. They'd just rather not be in work. Isn't that amazing? Now, let me tell you who has been open. First, in Louisiana, over 75% of our schools are reopened. Hats off to my state. Private and parochial schools have been open. Hats off to them. Kind of the business model. If you don't get paid, you show up for work. They show up for work. So let's give a hats off. And that's why there should be school choice. If a parent can't get their child educated in Los Angeles, in San Diego, or in Chicago, then why are we keeping that child from going to a private school? Oh, they can go, you say. Not if they're poor. If they're poor, they don't have the revenue. We should take the money that we're giving to those public schools that will not open because the teachers' unions oppose it and give it to the parents so their children can go to the school where their children will actually be educated. And the fact that we don't do that is politics over what is best for that child. It is a betrayal of those children. And this administration's policy 4 months into their 4 years demonstrates betrayal after betrayal after betrayal. Let's safely reopen schools now. We know we can do so. We knew that a year ago. Science, the data shows it. Congress has provided $68 billion before this latest bill in order to make sure we had everything we needed in order to do that. A lack of funding has not been an excuse to reopen. What is clear is a lack of will. And I'll repeat where I started. This administration is betraying the most vulnerable children in our country. Reopen schools now. With that, I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have to tell you, you can always tell how controversial a nominee is by how fast his supporters work to finish his confirmation process. And last night at 6:12, we found out that the Democrats tried to pull a fast one on Xavier Becerra's nomination. They were trying to fast track this. And I was able to object to that hotline request, but the fact that they tried it shows that they are worried about this nominee, and they should be. 2 unimpressive hearings and seeing the split vote on the Finance Committee. And I think my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have come to realize that his lack of experience in the healthcare sector is one of those big things. You know, we have over 400 healthcare companies in Tennessee and tens of thousands of employees in that sector. They all, each and every one of them, have more healthcare experience than the Biden administration's nominee for the Secretary of Health and Human Services. His greatest hits from his job keep coming back to haunt him, and as much as his allies here in the Senate try to spin his record, they just can't seem to convince people that he is fit to lead. I was curious how wide the divide is between Tennesseans and the Becerra nomination, so I asked my staff to look through our mailbag and see what people were calling and writing about. This nomination was in the top 5 issues of concern. People in Tennessee are not happy. As I mentioned, healthcare, our religious organizations. What they are seeing is somebody who has crossed the line too many times. They do not see him as fit to lead. His lack of experience in the healthcare industry explains why so many people would oppose him. He thinks it would be a good idea to take private health insurance away from 160 million Americans and throw them into a disastrous single-payer system. If that is what you want, then he would be a great Secretary of HHS for you. If he has his way, he will use his new position to further undermine our immigration laws. He's admitted his own admission, Mr. President, that given the chance, he would decriminalize illegal entry and extend Medicaid benefits to anyone who managed to make it across the border. It's like winning the lottery. You get across that border, we're going to give you health care benefits courtesy of the U.S. taxpayer. We cannot afford to keep confirming nominees who have zero respect for the rule of law, zero, and even less respect for the value of human life. Throughout his career, Mr. Becerra has made his appallingly radical positions on abortion very well known. He's proud to support abortion up until the moment of birth. He even opposed the 2003 partial birth abortion ban. He defended a truly evil California law that forced pro-life crisis pregnancy centers to advertise abortion services offered by state-run clinics. Recently, a physician friend of mine made a comment about Mr. Becerra's nomination that has really stuck with me. She said, "I'm horrified." Bear in mind, this is a physician, Mr. President. "I'm horrified by his position on abortion because he would abort a baby that I would resuscitate. He would abort a baby that a family is willing to adopt." Now think about that. This is a guy in his congressional career, in his job as the Attorney General for California. He is a radical on abortion, a radical. You have physicians who stand there to resuscitate these babies that have difficulty during birth. He would allow those babies to be aborted when a physician would choose life, would choose to help that baby live. According to Mr. Becerra, religious exemptions should be a thing of the past. He relentlessly harassed religious employers like Hobby Lobby and nonprofit organizations like the Little Sisters of the Poor as part of his crusade to uphold Obamacare's contraception mandate. I think it's clear why the Senate Finance Committee split their vote on this nomination. It has nothing to do with politics. Xavier Becerra's obsession with dismantling American society and rebuilding it in his own image can't be boiled down to a simple policy position. Instead, it signals his desire to force Americans to live their lives according to his twisted worldview. He may have the approval of leftists, but the American people and thousands of Tennesseans have already written him off as radically unqualified. And frankly, so have I. I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this motion to discharge and opposing the nomination. He is radically anti-life, anti-religion, anti-border security, anti-free speech. He is unqualified to lead. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Montana.
Mr. President, Montana has a rich outdoor heritage. It's something we're known for, not just across the country, but even around the world. It's something as Montanans we're very proud of. In fact, for generations, Montana families have enjoyed hunting, fishing, recreating on public lands. I myself am an avid outdoorsman. In fact, some of my fondest memories growing up in Montana are spending time with my family, with my dad, my mom, my grandpa, hunting, fishing, backpacking in our state. And thankfully, I've had a chance to pass it on to our own 4 children, something we still enjoy doing today. My wife and I, we're now empty nesters. Recreation on public lands is part of our Montana way of life. It's how we raise our families in Montana. And just as we cherish our access to our public lands, we also value the conservation of our lands, as well as the stewardship of our vast natural resources. Energy development flourishes in Montana. It provides over 16,000 hardworking men and women with good-paying jobs to support their families while funding conservation and protecting our landscapes and wildlife. Montana is still a state where hardworking moms and dads, they work hard during the week, thankful for many jobs provided by the natural resources in our state. They work hard during the week, but on the weekends, they go down to Walmart, Bob Ward Sportsman's Warehouse, any sporting goods store, and buy an elk tag over the counter, a fishing license, and get into our public lands within 30 minutes of buying that license. That's uniquely part of our Montana experience. These jobs that we have in the natural resource industry, these energy jobs, are part of who we are as Montanans. Because we're a state full of diverse interests, competing priorities, sometimes opposing philosophies. But time and time again, stakeholders have come together to find balance and achieve our most lasting conservation wins. That's a word that's missing in Washington, D.C., as we're seeing the new administration come to power. It's the word balance. You see, as Montanans, we're proud stewards of our beautiful landscapes, our rivers, our natural resources, and our wildlife. We take pride in following the science and listening to our local experts on the ground to do what's best for our environment and our public lands, as well as our rural communities. And this legacy of balance is intertwined within the jurisdiction of the Department of Interior, because the Secretary of the Interior oversees much of America's lands, our water, wildlife, energy resources. They in many ways oversee our Montana way of life. Over the past few years, we've seen secretaries of the Interior with a range of views. Some I agree with, some I haven't. But one thing was consistent. They were consensus builders. They were able to listen to the needs of diverse stakeholders, bring folks together, come up with a solution that worked for most everybody. I would use the word balance again. Unfortunately, Representative Haaland has a very well-documented and hostile record toward Made in America energy, toward natural resource development, towards wildlife management, and sportsmen. Throughout her tenure as a Congresswoman, Representative Haaland championed the Green New Deal. She advocated for the most extreme positions, including banning all fossil fuels. She co-sponsored legislation to provide federal protections for grizzly bears forever, without considering the science that's very clear that supports delisting that species and returning it back to the states, just like we did with wolves back in 2011. She's been enthusiastic in her calls to stop not just the Keystone Pipeline, but all pipelines, calling for a ban for all pipelines. She even protested the Dakota Access Pipeline herself. She has stated that trapping shouldn't be allowed on public lands. And as noted by several sportsman groups, Representative Haaland would not even commit to maintaining current access on our public lands during the hearing. I can tell you these are not mainstream views held by most Montanans. I'm not opposed to Representative Haaland's confirmation because she's a Democrat or because she was nominated by President Biden. In fact, I've supported many of the president's nominees. This is about her record, her very far left, divisive positions that will fail to represent the West, to be in the mainstream of common sense and balance. And I fear she will harm the Montana way of life as we know it. This is about protecting our Montana way of life, the ability to have a good paying job during the week and enjoying our public land on the weekends. Because you kill the energy jobs, you kill all the pipelines, you kill our natural resources, Montana is left to be simply a playground for the rich and famous. We've got to stand up for hardworking Montanans and protect their way of life. This is about maintaining a common sense balance. We can develop our natural resources and protect our public lands at the same time. We can do both, and we must do both. So I urge my colleagues, especially those from Western states that hold many of these same values, to really think about what Representative Haaland would bring to the Department of Interior as leader of that organization. I urge my colleagues to consider the impact this will have and to vote against Representative Haaland's nomination for Secretary of the Interior. Mr. President, I yield back my time.
We're going to be streaming on. Or maybe we can share. Actually, this guy. Yeah, there's definitely. Although, you know what, though? Yeah, that's Francis. Thank you for lights and all that. So the keep on there. So it's a mix. Yeah, so all the cars that people driving over to the airport will be for the last one. Okay. And you'll see a lot of photographers. There's a lot of supporters down there. Maybe some staff. Okay. No, but oh, what wonderful. So there's the boat. No, only like 5 minutes. Not done. Yeah. Thank you, Tracy, for doing that. Yeah. I spilled a little bit. Yeah, hold on. Hey, while you're up there, give me a buzz.
You good? Cool.
Yeah. I know. Yeah, I got like nothing. So it's like kind of good to see it. Yeah. So I was watching the local news last night. Gators are coming back. There goes Costello doing any live shots at the old bureau. Because they are so bad there that you can barely hear each other talk. We actually did a cicada story with Lisa Myers 17 years ago. And some of the big trees are crawling.